Many moral skeptics piously cite Hume's is-ought distinction as though it were well known to be the last word on the subject of morality until the end of the world. They insist that notions of what we ought to do or value can be justified only in terms of other oughts, never in terms of facts about the way the world is. Why hello my fellow apes, you ought to enjoy this one. Or should you? Just over a month ago, Sam Harris reaffirmed a series of tweets he wrote 2 years prior, in which he expressed how we can get from an is to an ought. Or in other words, how we can surpass David Hume's guillotine, which is considered by most moral philosophers as unsurpassable, as ironclad. Hume's guillotine, or as it's more commonly known, the is-ought problem, asserts that no ought statements can be inferred from premises expressed in only terms of is. And it relates to Harris, of course, because he claims in his moral landscape that science can determine human values.
So I'm going to argue that this is an illusion, that the separation between science and human values is an illusion, and actually quite a dangerous one at this point in human history.
Over the years, quite a few academically minded people have tried to explain to Harris where he's going wrong, but with evidently no success.
You're introducing a new assumption, that we should avoid the maximum pain for conscious creatures.
And given Harris's recent reaffirmation, I thought I'd do my best to explain the issue from a somewhat oblique perspective. As many of you know, unlike most who have critiqued Harris, I once accepted his moral landscape thesis outright, and while I don't anymore, I still think that it's a major contribution that with a few tweaks actually accomplishes what I suspect Harris intended. I'll expand on this later. Now, as the glorious Voltaire would insist, let's begin by defining our terms. The key terms are, unsurprisingly, is and ought. An is statement describes the way in which things are. It's a description of reality, a fact. A few examples are that the Earth revolves around the Sun, ice cream is high in calories, and Harris is the author of the moral landscape. In contrast to descriptive is statements, ought statements are prescriptive. They prescribe how reality should be. A few examples are, you ought to ask him out for a date, I should probably stop singing, and Harris ought to stop saying that Hume's guillotine is a trick. So that's the key terms defined, right? Well, at least in my opinion, no, not quite. Putting aside the fact that many definitions of ought either contain the word should or provide essentially the same definition as should, the primary word that really needs unpacking is prescription, and the reason for this is that prescriptions presume goals. Some definitions explicitly acknowledge this fact, such as the following. A prescription is a proposal or a plan which gives ideas about how to solve a problem or improve a situation, whereas other definitions don't acknowledge this presumption, such as a prescription is the act of telling someone else what they must have or do. The main thing I want to stress here is that if the person on the receiving end of the prescription doesn't hold the presumed goal, then the prescriptive statement is a fart in the wind. Prescriptions are predicated on goals, and words such as should, ought, good, and bad merely describe whether or not actions promote or impede the goal. Now, rather than reading Hume's words and laboriously explaining how moral philosophers arrived at the conventional interpretation, I'm just going to illustrate the guillotine through an example, which I'm borrowing from Professor Cole Nasrallah. Nasrallah, like myself, rides motorbikes, and she gives her students the following syllogism. Premise 1. Riding motorcycles is very dangerous. Therefore, you should not ride motorcycles. The great thing about this example is that the conclusion obviously doesn't follow from the premises, it's a non sequitur. The first premise is an is statement, it describes a fact, whereas the conclusion is an ought statement, it prescribes what one ought not do, and it's precisely because there is no ought premise that the conclusion doesn't follow. Without an ought premise, the ought conclusion is a fart in the wind. If we add the premise, you ought not do things that are dangerous, then the conclusion does follow. But notice that if we do this, we are not getting an ought from an is, but rather an ought from an ought and is. To reiterate, yes, one of the premises is purely factual, and some get caught up on this, but the guillotine doesn't assert that facts have no moral relevance. It merely asserts that if you have an ought conclusion, then there must be an ought somewhere in your premises. One last thing of note is that technically we could shroud an ought as an is, by saying it is the case that you believe that you ought not do things that are dangerous. But in such a case, the ought premise is merely concealed. We're still getting an ought from an ought. Alright, or as Harris would say, okay.
Okay.
With this in mind, let's address Harris's syllogism, one premise or tweet at a time. 1. Let's assume that there are no oughts or shoulds in this universe. There is only what is, the totality of actual and possible facts. At first glance, this appears to be a reductio ad absurdum, in which one attempts to establish a claim by showing that the opposite leads to an absurdity or contradiction. But for whatever reason Harris chose this as a first premise, it isn't for the purpose of reductio. He doesn't go on to demonstrate how this assumption results in absurdity or contradiction. And so let's put this aside from the outset. It appears that with this premise, Harris is just trying to make clear that he's not starting with his conclusion. 2. Among the myriad things that exist are conscious minds, susceptible to a vast range of actual and possible experiences. I see nothing controversial with this premise. Harris is merely describing facts about sentient creatures. He's explicitly in the realm of is statements. 3. Unfortunately, many experiences suck. And that, ladies and gentlemen, and for reasons I'm about to provide, is game over. Before I do so, however, let's read the rest of the premise for full context. Unfortunately, many experiences suck, and they don't just suck as a matter of cultural convention or personal bias, they really and truly suck. If you doubt this, place your hand on a hot stove and report back. You know, I don't really want to put my hand on a hot stove. But why? Well, let's spell it out in a syllogism. Premise 1. Putting your hand on a hot stove reduces your well-being. Therefore, you should not put your hand on a hot stove. This is strikingly similar to Nasrallah's motorcycle syllogism, and it suffers precisely the same problem. It's a non sequitur. The conclusion that I should not put my hand on a hot stove, that it would suck to put my hand on a hot stove, is as fallacious as the conclusion that I should put my hand on a hot stove, that it would be brilliant to put my hand on a hot stove. But if we add the premise, you ought not do things that reduce your well-being, then we have a valid argument. But in such a case, we're not getting an ought from an is, but rather an ought from an ought and is. Thus, in an argument in which Harris is aiming to prove that we ought to do anything, he's using language that presupposes a standard, a goal, and since oughts and shoulds are prescriptions that are predicated on goals, I would say, yes, Harris is begging the question. And hence he has not surpassed Hume's guillotine, he has not bridged the is-or gap. He hasn't got from is to ought from solely is statements. Now you might be thinking that I'm making a presumption on the definition of suck that Harris is using, and that's a fair concern, and so let me give you my reasons as to why I believe we're justified in this assumption. First and foremost, Harris doesn't hide the fact that he defines good as that which supports well-being. Here's how he puts it on page 15 of the Moral Landscape. If we define good as that which supports well-being, as I will argue we must, the regress initiated by More's open question argument really does stop. And because of this, it follows that he defines bad as that which does not support well-being. Ergo, he tells us that putting our hand on a hot stove will suck because having our flesh fall from our fingers is bad. It sucks for our well-being. And the second reason I think it's fair to make this assumption is due to Harris's choice words of, they don't just suck as a matter of cultural convention or personal bias, they really and truly suck. For something to really and truly suck, there must be an objective goal in reference. Put it this way, if Harris is saying that it really and truly sucks without reference to a goal, then he's just farting in the wind. Whereas if he's saying it in reference to a goal, which in his case is well-being, then he's correct. It's not just a matter of opinion that putting one's hand on a hot stove is bad in light of the goal of maximising well-being. It is objectively, scientifically and factually bad in light of the goal of maximising well-being. If your opinion is that it's good in light of maximising well-being, then either 1, you've got a sound argument for why putting one's hand on a hot stove will eventually maximise well-being, or 2, you're just wrong. But to cover all angles, if Harris isn't using a definition of suck that's related to bad, then, as we're about to see, his argument doesn't make any sense at all. He doesn't get to any ought. 4. Conscious minds are natural phenomena. Consequently, if we were to learn everything there is to know about physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, economics, etc., we would know everything there is to know about making our corner of the universe suck less. Yes, if we knew everything, we'd know precisely how to make things suck less in accordance to any axiom or goal, but it doesn't follow that we should have a specific axiom or goal. 5. If we should do anything in this life, we should avoid what really and truly sucks. If you consider this question begging, consult your stove, as above. Again, I won't consult my stove because I happen to believe that I ought to maximise my well-being, and in relation to this goal, having my flesh melt would suck even more than listening to a sermon from Frank Turek.
Where do you get your morality from if we're just molecules in motion? What is morality?
Yeah, on second thoughts, just bring me the stove. But the fact that I won't consult my stove is merely evidence that I want to maximise my well-being. It isn't in any way a proof or justification for why I should maximize my well-being. 6. Of course, we can be confused or mistaken about experience. Something can suck for a while, only to reveal new experiences which don't suck at all. On these occasions, we say, at first that sucked, but it was worth it. I see no issues with this premise. Being stabbed over 100,000 times might suck at first, but the beautiful tattoo in the end will be worth it. 7. We can also be selfish and short-sighted. Many solutions to our problems are zero-sum. My gain will be your loss. But better solutions aren't. By what measure of better? Fewer things suck. The word better, like the words good, superior, or greater, only have meaning in reference to a standard, a goal, as is the case with words such as sucks, bad, inferior, and worse. The question is, better in accordance to what standard? Well-being? Sure, we can say that some act is better than another in servitude of well-being, but we can't just say that one act is better without any reference, without any standard. 8. So what is morality? What ought sentient beings like ourselves do? Understand how the world works, facts, so that we can avoid what sucks, values. So there's Harris's conclusion, and if you weren't already convinced that he's defining suck in relation to bad, then I'm sure you are now. To put it bluntly, this conclusion just doesn't make any sense if he's not defining the word suck in such a way. But if he is defining it in such a way, then, as already said, his argument is indeed begging the question. To bridge the is-ought gap, if indeed such a thing is even possible, one must get a value judgment from exclusively factual premises. But to say that something sucks is to express a value judgment. Earlier, I said that I still find Harris's moral landscape to be of great value, and I'll conclude by explaining why. Whilst Hume's guillotine isn't in and of itself a trick, a fair amount of people have nevertheless tricked themselves into thinking that science and facts are utterly irrelevant to morality, and at truly grotesque cost. Under the rubric of respecting other cultures, otherwise very intelligent people shrug their shoulders at the suffering of others, because they've convinced themselves that they have no justification to intervene. Harris talks of this at length in multiple chapters, and it's my interpretation that it's this apathetic crowd that he wrote the moral landscape to startle. They witness, for instance, women being treated as second-class citizens, and are convinced, ironically, that it would be egregious for them to speak against such atrocity. Further still, some of these people accuse people like Harris, or myself, as being authoritarian, since we want to force our beliefs on others. But this simply isn't true. Perhaps my favourite moral philosopher, Jeremy Bentham, wrote that nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. On the one hand, the standard of right and wrong, on the other the chain of causes and effects, are fastened to their throne. They govern us in all we do, in all we say, in all we think. Every effort we make to throw off our subjection will serve but to demonstrate and confirm it. The point of my quoting Bentham is that whilst there's nothing to say that we ought to value our well-being, everybody does, courtesy of evolution by natural selection. Given this, we can, and indeed should, attempt to correct the moral mistakes of others. If you think I'm not serving my goal of maximising my well-being because I believe that some fact is true when it's not, tell me. Don't just shrug your shoulders and say, oh, it's another culture. No. If I'm subordinating half the human race because of an edict in a book that I'm convinced was created by the architect of the universe, correct me. Show me how the facts that I believe in are not true. Show me how my arguments are not sound, and I'll drop the book. The moral landscape is perhaps the most useful source we currently have to make this case, but it's really unfortunate that the author, whom I have a lot of respect for, still claims that he surpassed Hume's guillotine. Harris, good sir, the bad news is that you haven't, but the good news is that you never needed to. Despite being called the is-ought problem, it's not a problem, and that's a statement of fact, not a value judgment. Anyhow,
Okay.
thank you all kindly for the view, I really appreciate it. And of course, an extra special thank you to my wonderful patrons who can now vote on 4 new posters to be designed.